Well, good morning.
Good morning.
This is the Christian Kingdom Bible Study. We are studying the book of Acts. It's a wonderful book. We're in chapter 20. In fact, we are beginning chapter 20. So, we will proceed. NIV version, verse number 1. He says, when the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. Okay, after the roar had ceased, now we're talking about the riot that happened in chapter 19. So calm had returned to Ephesus. So perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps the riot of Demetrius caused Paul to leave Ephesus a little earlier than what he planned on. But anyway, he was kind of a little behind schedule as far as he was concerned. But anyway, he wouldn't leave Ephesus until he had sent for the disciples. And King James says, embraced them. And then NIV says, encouraged them. Two different words, two different meanings, but nevertheless, he encouraged them, he strengthened them. And what does new Christians need? In fact, what do all Christians need? Encouragement. Encouragement. Paul was always giving encouragement. Paul was encouraged by what he was doing and what he was saying, and the Lord. But, we have hard times and rough times, and sometimes we don't actually look towards heaven. Sometimes things, and I hate to say it, but sometimes things become old hat to us. And that's not good. The scriptures tell us to look towards heaven, to get encouragement, to get strength, because when we look towards heaven, we're looking towards our new home. I don't know about you, but I fantasize quite often about our new home. When I say fantasize, I'm using my imagination, because we've done a lot of studying on our new home, but there's still a lot there that we don't understand. And when you think about it, those of the Old Testament time, they didn't actually have what we have. We have a whole lot more than what they had. But nevertheless, when things are really hard and tough and you're having a rough time, it's a good idea to look towards what is coming, because that's always the encouraging thing. Think about our new homes. Think about what our new homes are going to be like. Think about the things that we've been doing there. Thinking about the beauty of the place. Thinking about being with the Lord Jesus Christ. Thinking about being with your friends all the time. Thinking about being in a place where there's no more sin. There's no more pain. No more agony. No more suffering. I mean, you can't even begin to imagine what lies ahead of us. And Paul was always encouraging those, especially the new Christians, because they were facing a whole lot of problems that were coming up, and it was down the road. Because, as a new Christian today, we don't suffer nearly as much as they did back in those days. Back in those days, especially if you were a Jew and you joined the Church of Christ, that automatically it meant that you lost your money, you lost your bank account, you lost your job, your family would disown you. You had nothing left except what you had joined, and you were joining something that you actually didn't have a whole lot of knowledge of. And so they become very dependent on one another. They encourage one another. So Paul knew that the devil would be setting some traps for them to step into, and so he was well aware that some serious, dangerous times were coming, and these things would be caused by false teachers. And let's take a look. We'll get to it later, but let's just jump to verse 29, I believe it is. Acts 20 and verse 29. And later, Paul would be talking to the elders about this. Verse 28 or verse 27, let's start with that. He says, "For I have not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God." And he says, guard yourselves and all of the flock. He's talking about the elders now, of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Be shepherds of the church, which he bought with his own blood. For I know, Paul said, I know that after I leave, savage wolves, and we'll get into that later, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. And in verse 30 he says, even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. Now think about that. Huh? And that happened. He said later on, there would be those who disclaimed the Word of God. They were more interested in getting people to follow them than they were to get people to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. And he had no doubt also concerning that the Ephesians might be intimidated by the threat of another riot as they had before. So I would say that there was parting words as Paul left, parting words and blessings and holy kiss all around. In Romans, and you don't have to turn to it, but in Romans 16:16, Paul gave a command to the young Christians. He said, greet one another with a holy kiss. What is a holy kiss? We don't know, do we? Well, holy kiss. Now, I can understand what happened here, okay? A holy kiss, what was, I used to give Chuck Dowdy a holy kiss. That is it's a special type of love, and you just kind of just give them a little peck on the cheek is actually what it is. It's a welcome thing. You just not grab them, but just gently a kiss on the cheek, and they used to do that all the time back in those days with their church members. But it signified the fact that you missed them and you liked to be around them, and it was just you were happy for the time that you had there with them. Well, eventually it become perverted, and as of course everything that humans touch gets perverted sooner or later, and they downgraded the holy kiss to a holy handshake, and then it went further than that, downgraded it to simply a nod. And today we're at that stage where we very seldom even recognize one another. But this Paul, they were leaving, and he called the disciples, that is the young Christians there, he called them together, and I would imagine, this is only my opinion because we're not told, but I would say that they were, parting words that Paul would have had, and then blessings and a holy kiss all the way around. Because Paul had put in a lot of love and a lot of time and a lot of work to get these young Christians to the point where they were. And Paul knew what lay ahead of them. That they were going to have a battle with the devil. There was going to be a war. because the devil doesn't like to lose people, which you could understand. The Lord doesn't like to lose people. The devil, he gets very upset when people leave him and go to be with the Lord. And especially back at this time when the Church of Christ was new. And so the false teachers that lay ahead would be working harder and harder and harder to undo all that Paul had done. And Paul knew that that's what they were going to be facing. And they were going to have a lot of trouble down the road. So in verse number 1, we're told that he departed to go to Macedonia. And when he'd gone through those districts, well, Luke, now Luke is very brief as he passes over a very important time in Paul's life. I think it's a very important time, but Luke just kind of passes over it with not a whole lot being said, but we're going to fill in the best we can as we go along. So Paul had a plan. Paul planned to travel from Ephesus to Jerusalem through the Greek district of Macedonia, which would have been actually the northern section of Macedonia. And Paul now is in Macedonia, and he was hoping to meet Titus. Titus was supposed to meet him there, and in fact he did a little bit later on. He ran into him in Philippi, which was actually in Macedonia also. And Titus gave him some good news about the increase of the Gentile church and how things were going. And then that brings us up to verse 3. It says, after 3 months in Achaia. Now, most of that, actually, that 3 months was spent in Corinth. It was time for Paul to continue his journey. So he had intended to catch a ship at Cenchrea, which was a Corinthian seaport. Now, about the 3 months, it says after 3 months in Achaia. As I said, Luke just kind of drifts over a lot of these. But the 3 months here was from January to March. That would have been in the year 58 AD. Paul spent the winter there because it was going to be a hard winter, and he didn't want to try to press and go on to the next point. So he decided to stop there because he had a reason now. He decided to stop there and spend the winter there. And while he was there, he wrote a letter to the Church of Christ in Rome. And he was warning them about false teachers, because there's always been false teachers, and there always will be false teachers. You see, if you look at it today, and I know it's hard, and people don't like to hear it, at least the majority of the people, but the Church of Christ, see, this was the only church at this time. The church means called out. So, the church building isn't the church. You, as a Christian, you as a baptized believer in Christ, you're the church. And that means called out of the world, called out of the sin, called out of the army of the devil. And so he spent 3 months there. Those 3 months that he spent there, he wrote the book of Romans here. And that was in Romans 16:16, where he said to give one another a holy kiss. But back in those times, it was very important for them to encourage and strengthen one another. So it's not surprising now in verse 3 that when he was about to set sail for Syria, he became aware of a plot that had been formed against him by the Jews of Corinth. Remember 1 Peter 5:8? It says, the devil is your enemy. 1 Peter 5:8. Just always remember that. The devil is your enemy. And he's prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Now, who you think that someone would be?
Christians.
The easiest prey, right? The weakest Christian, right? That's why he tells us that the devil is our enemy, and he's looking for somebody to devour. He was looking for some way to assassinate Paul in this particular situation. So the devil has a plan. You see, the Jews now, they hadn't forgotten the shocking conversion of the synagogue leader, Crispus. I don't know if you remember him or not. That was back in chapter 18. He was a synagogue leader. He was a leader of the synagogue. Only a Jew could do that. Only a dedicated, devoted Jew could do that. But yet Paul was able to convert him to Christianity and got him baptized, and this irritated the Jews there in the synagogue. And so the devil wouldn't let them forget that. And also their humiliating defeat before the proconsul Gallio. Remember Gallio, who put them in their place. See, the devil never forgets. The devil doesn't sleep. He doesn't have to. He never forgets. The devil knows exactly the day, the time, and etc. that you were baptized. He knows when you stepped away from him. He never forgets that. And that irritates him to no ends. And he does everything that he can to get you back. Just like right now in our assembly. I can guarantee you right now there are demons here. There are demons here. What are they doing? They're listening to what be said. And then they'll translate that back to the devil. Because he wants to know what's going on. The devil can't be in every place at the same time like the Lord Jesus Christ can. And so they report back to him. And then he gives them instructions of what to do. They're here. They'll always be. Because they want to know exactly what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it. Because when he gets an opportunity, doesn't matter how small it may be, if you give him a quarter of an inch, he'll press that out until he gets a foot. He's looking for an opportunity to do something, say something. It may be small, it may be large. You may not even think it's an opportunity, but for the devil, he's looking for it. As he's prowling around all the time, looking for somebody to devour. So, Luke now records Luke does not record the details of this plot. It says that there was a plot was formed. That means there was a plan. Those Jews in Corinth, they knew where Peter was, or where Paul was. And so they knew that he was planning on taking a ship. It was a small boat, small ship. And so these Jews plotted, they made up a plan. Now we don't know what that plan was, because Luke doesn't tell us. But Paul would have been an easy target for murder on a small ship, especially one that was crowded with Jewish travelers. It would have been very easily for somebody to have simply thrown him overboard and let him drown. And so Paul, the plot caused Paul to change his plans, and Paul had a plan also. Paul did not travel alone. He was accompanied by, verse 4, he was accompanied by Sopater, who was of Berea, son of Parias, and he also had Aristarchus with him. He had Secundus with him. He was from Thessalonica. He had Gaius with him, and he had Tychicus, and he had Trophimus. So the question is, who were these men, and why were they with Paul? Money, money, money. Now remember, maybe you don't remember, but all the time as Paul goes along with these different congregations, Paul's taking up a collection. What's the collection for? The church of Jerusalem. Because they were having a rough time. Remember, they back when Paul was Saul, they split up the church back then. And the church in Jerusalem just went everywhere. That's how the word of God spread in different places. It went everywhere. But there were some that stayed in Jerusalem because they needed, that was where the home church was in Jerusalem. And they were having some rough times. And so Paul was picking up a collection as he went along to give to Jerusalem when he got to Jerusalem. And that was what he was doing here. He was on his way to Jerusalem. So he had these men with him. Now he learned about this plot that the devil had. And he decided not to go by the boat. Now Paul, of course, if he heard about the plot, he knew what they were planning to do. But we don't know. But anyway, Paul had a plan. And actually it was good. It was really good. It's something for us to remember. See, each of the congregation that had shared in the collecting and offering for Jerusalem had sent some of their own men to deliver their part of the money. Now, what Paul intended to do when he got to Jerusalem, he intended to introduce these men to the Jerusalem church, and then he would let them give what their congregation had donated to them as part of the offering. So the point was, Paul wanted to avoid any suspicion. Now, see, you had to be very careful here, especially in the church, but also in the secular world, because he remember, the devil always watching. The devil's always looking. He's always looking for an opportunity. And this is I know a person personally in the Church of Christ that lost his position in the Church of Christ because of what's going on here. See, Paul, he wanted to avoid any suspicion that he was only collecting the money to put in his own pocket. See, those people that are donating, they don't know. And the devil could very easily accuse and cause problem. That's why 1 Peter says, be alert, be alert. The devil's watching. And also remember now, back at that time, there was no such thing as checks, and there was no such thing as paper money. So the money had to be carried in gold or silver. And it had to be carried on the person. So it was important that no one person was loaded down so that, well, let's say the sharp eye of a robber would notice and rob them. Now, can you imagine? After collecting all that money, they're on the way to Jerusalem, and they get robbed. Now, what are they going to tell those at Jerusalem? They're going to say, well, we were on our way, but we got robbed. You know how well that's going to go over, don't you? Huh? And they say, well, Paul say, well, I got witnesses. These guys are there with me. Yeah, right. Y'all were putting that money in your pocket, wasn't you? Well, that's what this friend of mine was accused of. He had some money that he was supposed to deliver, and he got accused of putting some of it in his pocket. And that's why, see, when these people, when it's okay to, let's say even in today, right now, you have some help doing something, and so you go on the internet, and you ask for help. But you have to be very cautious that is very open, that there is no possibility whatsoever that could be turned against you. Because the devil, not so much the secular world, but the devil is watching a Christian. So you have to be careful that you yourself, individually, don't handle that money, that somebody else, somewhere down the line, has responsibility. And they're protected also. So anyway, verse number 7, it tells us that Paul was in Troas for 7 days. Now, why so long? I don't know, because we're not told. But most think that he was waiting to worship with the local congregation. So we pick up on verse number 7 there, and I'll go ahead and read it here. Verse number 7. Okay, it says, NIV version now. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul preached to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. Okay. On the first day of the week. Now, I want to be very careful here because I have to make this clear what we're talking about here. This is important. Of course, it's all important. But anyway, on the first day of the week. Now, that expression, the first day of the week. Why didn't I just say Sunday? Now, we're back in this time. This was, excuse me, this was used because the Jews did not have a name for the days of the week. So they had to refer to the days before or the days after the Sabbath. Now, what is the Sabbath? Saturday. Okay, that's for us to remember, because then it was the Sabbath. Today it's Saturday. So, for us, the first day after Saturday, or after the Sabbath, would be what? Sunday, yeah. See, the Jews, they didn't have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and etc. It was the day after the Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath, or the second day after the Sabbath, the third day after the Sabbath, and etc. They didn't have weekly days. So that was why, why this was written as it was. On the first day of the week. That would be the first day after the Sabbath. All right, now for us, which is important. It was the Lord's Day. It was Sunday. The first day of the week is Sunday. Okay? Now, question. What time was Luke using? Because, see, there was two different times. There was a Jewish time, and there was a Roman time. The Jews, they counted a day from sunset, like sunset today, to sunset tomorrow. That was a day. That's how they figured a day. From sunset to sunset. Now the Romans, they counted from midnight to midnight. So the question is, was it a daytime or a nighttime meeting? Well, to make a long story short, I believe Luke was using the Roman time, okay, and I'll verify that in a little bit. And so this meeting was on the day that we call Sunday. But be as it may, when the Lord's Day came, they gathered together as a congregation now, and it says they broke bread. Now, breaking bread to us is the Lord's Supper. So this congregation was meeting together, not actually to hear Paul preach, but to take the Lord's Supper. Now, Paul began in verse 7. Paul began talking with them. So the question is, did Paul's teaching session happen before or after the Lord's Supper? Now, see, those are all important questions. Now, Luke Fortunately, Luke gives us some important information here. Now, in verse number 8, Luke gives us some important information here. Now, see if you can pick this out. Luke says that there were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Now, that gives us a lot of information there. There were many lamps. King James says light, but lamps is actually the proper language, because back in those days, when you think lights, you think lights. But they didn't have electricity and that kind of stuff. Back in those days, remember the old kerosene lamps? You put kerosene in, you had a wick, and you lit the wick, you put the globe on it, then you turned it up, and it became bright. But if you turned it up too high, what happened? Smoke came out of there, black smoke came out of there, crank her back down. Well, this is basically the same thing. These were lamps that they put oil in, and they burn them, of course, for lights, because they didn't have the electric lights back in those days. So he says that there were many lights in the upper room. And he says there was a certain man named Euchaeus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep, and he fell down from the third floor and was picked up dead. Now, see, Luke was also at the meeting, and so that's good, because see, he can provide us with eyewitness testimony of this meeting, what happened, and etc. In verse number 7 says that there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together. So my question is this: why did Luke give us this information? You know, to some it would seem like a waste of time, a waste of space, and etc. So why did Luke give us this information? Now, he may have, some have suggested that he may have mentioned the lamps to show that the church had nothing to hide from the pagan neighbors, because you could understand what would be going on. See, now this was a third floor. Now back in those days, 3 stories was really unusual. So this probably was a business house. The business was on the first floor, and the people lived on the next 2 floors. We don't know exactly the size of the room. But another thing, see, the very early Christians, see, they celebrated the Lord's Supper as part of what, we would call it a potluck meal, if you would. You know what a potluck meal is. We used to, church we used to go to up in Ohio, every once in a while. Actually, I enjoyed it. Every once in a while, they would have, after service, a potluck lunch. You know, different people, you just brought whatever you brought, you know. I remember one time we ended up with eight bowls, and there were all 8 bowls of spaghetti. That was after a Wednesday night. But, you know, and then they put it on the table, and then, you know, you just go around and take what you want, and then, you know, you sit down and you eat and you talk with one another, or you just have a good time, you know, having, you know, fellowship with one another. That's what potlucks were all about at this time, see. But the early church, we always have to go back in time to to when the church began. The early church is what we're talking about. They celebrated the Lord's Supper as a part of a potluck meal. See, they called it a love feast. Now, why? Why did they do that? See, back in those days, I know we don't like to talk about it, but back in those days, they did have slaves. People did own people. Now, depending on whom your owner was, some of them gave their slaves more freedom than what others did. But nevertheless, a slave had a certain amount of work to do, and it had to be done. And so, in other words, they worked from sun up to sundown. Now, this was to help slaves who could only come when the day's work was done. In other words, they didn't have time to eat anything or nothing like that in order to get to the fellowship and to that time. So the problem that the many oil burning lamps, as we talked before, would have added fumes and smoke to a stuffy atmosphere. Now, we know by verse 9 where Eutychus was sitting on a window sill. We know that the room was crowded. We do know that the seats were all gone. So this young man, Eutychus, sat wherever he could sit, and just happened to be the windowsill. But also, it would have been an open windowsill, and it would have been where the air, of course, would have been the freshest and the coolest. So even there, however, he began to gradually sink into a deep sleep. He was trying to not go to sleep, but he just lost the fight, and off he goes, and he falls into this deep sleep. And as he falls into this deep sleep, he loses his balance. Now, I'm going to add more to this. Did he lose his balance, or was he pushed? Remember what I said before. Now, the devil's always watching. The demons are always... There were demons here at this time. They're always watching. And my opinion is, they may have not had a direct result, causing a man to go to sleep. But I think when he went to sleep, I think this demon nudged him, and out the window he goes. Now, as he goes out the window, what's going to happen? He's going out the window. He's going to be tumbling like this, and he's going down 3 stories, and hits a stone pavement down below. Now, we can only imagine what it would have done to him. I don't know how he lit. Whether he lit on his back, or he lit on his head, his belly, I don't know, but it certainly would have broken some bones, would have probably crushed his head, would have probably mutilated his face. And he fell 3 floors, landing on a stone pavement. Now, verse number 10 tells us that Paul rushed down along with everybody else. Now, you've got three stories down. Out the window he goes. So Paul and the rest of them, probably all that was there, I don't know how many was there, rushed down. And when he got down there, well, let me read verse 10 here for you. When he got down there, Paul went down, says Paul, but we know that all the rest of them would have been pushing their way down. Some probably got down there before Paul. And anyway, Paul went down, and when he got down there, it says, NIV version, that he threw himself on the young man. He put his arms around him. One version has it, he pulled him to him. And he said, "Don't be alarmed. He's alive." Now, can you imagine that? Now, in other words, when he went down, he was laying on the ground, and Paul just prostrated himself on top of the man. And when he did that, then the Lord gave this man back his life. Now, I would love to know. We don't know. Luke doesn't tell us. He doesn't give any indication. Was he a Christian? Or was he not a Christian? The reason I say, because I see the devil in this. I really do. I see the devil in this. I can't help it. Verse 11, NIV has then, after Paul went down, fell down on this man, pulled him up to him, and then he said to them, don't worry, he's alive. Then, NIV, then he, that is Paul, went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking all night, he left. Now the question says he went upstairs, broke bread and ate, and after talking all night, left. Question, was this the Lord's Supper, or was this a common meal? Now that's very important for us. See, some try to make an issue of this. So we want to take a look at this and make sure that we understand. When do we take the Lord's Supper? After, right? After. Yeah, after. Okay. So first of all, we had to put ourselves back. I've said this so many times. When I'm studying, I try to put myself back to that time span. So we had to put ourselves back to the beginning of the Church of Christ. See, the Church of Christ is a whole lot different today than it was in the beginning because of the people. The people is the church, remember. In a family gathering, neatness really doesn't count too much. If you're having a family gathering, it doesn't really matter how you dress when you come, right? You don't have to get all spruced up and said, you come as you want to come, because it doesn't really matter that much. It's a family gathering, see? So, setting tables, eating, doing dishes, doesn't really matter. And Paul liked to teach the Jewish style. What I mean by that is he liked to teach with questions and then interact with the people. Now, verse 10, Paul was interrupted when Eutychus fell out the open window and hit the ground 3 stories down, and he was killed. Now, Paul goes back up, or he goes down and brings it back to life. Then he goes back upstairs. Now, note what it says in verse 11. He went upstairs again and broke bread. Now, I want you to know something here. After breaking bread, what does it say? He broke bread and what? Ate. He broke bread and ate. Now, you don't eat the Lord's Supper. There's nothing there to eat, is there? No, you don't eat the Lord's Supper. So, this was what they called a love feast. They took the Lord's Supper, and then, after they took the Lord's Supper, they had a common meal. They had a supper time. See, they ate together, in other words. And as they ate together, Paul continued to teach, because that's the way he liked to teach. Now, this was for, remember, as I said before, for the slaves. more so than anything else, because they didn't have opportunity to make anything, to bring anything, or to eat anything before they left their work and came here. So when they came here and they had this common meal, this was to help the slaves enjoy the gathering together, because they had an opportunity to eat together. That's what it was all about. That would be like, well, I mean, how else can you say it? See, these were people that back in those times, unfortunately, were owned by other people, and they had work to do, and they couldn't leave, couldn't do anything else. And if their owner permitted, which some did, they could do whatever they wanted to do, and some wanted to join the Church of Christ, and so they joined the Church of Christ. Well, when the church met, they had to accommodate them. What good would it do to have a church meeting when people couldn't go to church meeting but wanted to go to church meeting? So they decided then to have these two. They took the Lord's Supper first, and then after they took the Lord's Supper, then the preacher would start preaching as everybody else started to have their common meal together. What's the problem with that? Well, there was a problem later on. That's why we don't have what they call a love feast today. Someone started eating before they took the Lord's Supper. All right, chapter 20 is what some call a chapter of memory, and rightfully so. In verses, and we're not going to cover these, because verses 13 down through 38, 13 through 38 are for Paul and the Ephesian elders. It's for them. It has nothing whatsoever to do with us. I mean, we could go ahead and dissect and etc., but we've already been through all this. So this was for them. They were meeting, see? It was for Paul and them. Paul was leaving, and he was never going to come back again. And so this was a time of remembrance, we might say. He talked about his willingness to die for the gospel. He warned the elders of coming trouble. He warned the elders to be prepared for what was going to happen. He was letting them know in advance. He reminded them of their responsibility to protect the flock. See, these were elders. See, back when you go back to the beginning of the church, when a congregation was large enough, and people, some people were given the ability to lead the church. In Timothy, there are qualifications for elders. You had to qualify to be an elder, because it's a very important job, a very important role. And so you have to want the job on top of that. But their responsibility is to protect the people, to protect the congregation. One of the qualifications also is they must have the ability to preach. So they had to be able to fill in if the preacher isn't there, or if they don't have a preacher, and the elder has to be able to fill in, because the elder is responsible. If you and somebody else has a complaint about somebody in the congregation, then you go to the elder and you explain this to the elder. The elder then takes his role. His responsibility is to sort this out, because as a Christian, we're not supposed to take our problems to the civil court. We don't take them to the local courts. We settle our problems ourselves. Now, I understand we're living in a different world in different times, but anyway, that was the way it was supposed to be, and was for many times. Okay, anyway, that brings us to verse 36 and 38. So we're just going to skip those three verses, or those verses altogether, not three verses, but those verses altogether. So 36, we come down here. Okay, so he says, picking up on 36, says, when he had said this, he knelt down with all of them and prayed. They all wept as they embraced him and kissed him. That's what the holy kiss. What grieved them most was his statement that they would never see his face again. And then they accompanied him to the ship. All right, so they prayed together. You see, there was a real love between Paul and the elders of Ephesus. There were tears, and they had genuine grief because Paul was leaving, and the fact that they would never see his face again. So this literally broke their hearts, and so it was that the elders, they followed Paul down to the edge of the water. And so this is where they had their hugs and their brotherly kisses and their farewell giving, and then off Paul goes, headed for Jerusalem. And we'll close here. That brings us up to Acts 21, and verse 4 says, "And after looking up the disciples, he stayed there 7 days." And they kept telling Paul that through the Spirit not to set foot into Jerusalem. And when it came about that our days there were ended, we departed and started on our journey. While they all, I thought this was something, now, Paul's leaving. They're not down to the water yet, but they're leaving. And it says, they all, with wives and children and all, the whole congregation escorted us, that Luke said us, until we were out of the city. And after kneeling down on the beach and prayed, we said farewell to one another. And then he went on board the ship, and they, I thought this was very emotional, and they returned home again. You can almost feel the emotion here when Luke says, and they returned home again. It's well, anyway, we'll stop there. We'll pick up, Lord willing, next week in Acts chapter 21, starting with verse 1.